American grunge rocker Chris Cornell has died at the age of 52.
Chris Cornell had 9 broken ribs and a gash in the back of his head when he hung him. Yes. And they said the official story is from the CPR. The CPR, he was already dead when they got there, and they break 9 ribs during CPR.
Chris Cornell's story doesn't end where you think. He rose from Seattle's shadows and gave the world an unforgettable sound. But what unfolded in his final hours still stirs fierce debate. The official story left too many questions, and the rumors have only grown louder. This is not just another tale of a star lost too soon. It is a deeper look into the mysteries that linger, the secrets that refuse to fade, and the haunting truth behind what really happened to Chris Cornell. The voice that was a battlefield. Chris Cornell was born Christopher John Boyle on July 20th, 1964, in Seattle, Washington. He was not the kind of child who was ever truly comfortable in his own skin. His early years were spent drifting between moments of laughter and long stretches of isolation. Cornell's parents, Karen and Ed, came from working-class roots, and their family life was anything but simple. When Cornell was a boy, his parents divorced, and his mother took custody, changing her children's last name to her maiden name, Cornell. The scars of this early separation would shape him for decades to come. From childhood, Chris showed signs of deep sensitivity and quiet suffering. By age 10, he had stopped going to school altogether. He withdrew into his room and listened obsessively to the Beatles. He barely spoke, preferring the company of records to people, finding solace in melodies and lyrics that seemed to echo his own sense of not belonging. He described this time as the year he disappeared. No one noticed that a young boy was vanishing behind the closed doors of a Seattle bedroom. Even as a child, Cornell's mind was a battlefield. Depression settled in like a dense fog, and by age 13, he was already experimenting with harmful substances and alcohol. It was not about rebellion, it was about survival. The world felt too sharp, too loud, too cold, and substances offered a way to numb the pain, even as they opened the door to new dangers. But from the darkness, something remarkable emerged. Chris taught himself to play drums, guitar, piano, whatever instruments he could get his hands on. His ear for music was almost supernatural. He could recall every note of every song, and soon he was writing music of his own. In music, he found his only reliable shelter, a way to turn the chaos inside his head into something that could touch the hearts of others. How does someone turn their pain into power? And can the creative spark really save a person from themselves? For Chris Cornell, the answer was always complicated. Soundgarden and the Seattle Revolution. Seattle in the late 1970s was not yet the epicenter of rock history, but it was brewing a quiet storm. Grunge had not been named, but its seeds were being planted in the rain-soaked basements and crowded bars of the city. Chris, after a series of odd jobs and struggles, found himself playing drums for local bands, until the formation of Soundgarden in 1984 changed everything. At first, Cornell was both drummer and lead singer, an unusual combination that reflected his reluctance to step into the spotlight. But when Matt Cameron joined as drummer, Chris's voice, unique, powerful, sometimes fragile, took center stage. Together with Kim Thayil and Hiro Yamamoto, Soundgarden forged a sound that was heavy, dark, and impossibly raw. The band's early work was not polished or commercial. The Screaming Life EP, released in 1987, was rough around the edges, but it caught the attention of the underground music scene. The album Ultra Mega OK followed in 1988, earning a Grammy nomination and setting the band on a path toward national recognition. Soundgarden's music reflected the unrest and confusion of a generation coming of age during the late Cold War years. Chris's lyrics were not about sex, harmful substances, or rebellion for its own sake. They were about pain, alienation, and the desperate need to feel alive, even when every day felt like a struggle. He sang of black days, of being outshined, of falling on the wrong side of love and hope. The band's sound, part metal, part punk, part something completely new, was a direct reflection of Chris's own divided soul. By the time Badmotorfinger arrived in 1991, Soundgarden was helping to define what would become known as the grunge movement. Alongside bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Alice in Chains, they brought a new honesty and intensity to rock music. Chris was the emotional epicenter, a frontman whose voice could fill a stadium one moment and break your heart the next. The journey was just beginning, and already the cost of genius was becoming clear. What does it take to become a voice for a generation, and what do you lose in the process? Chris Cornell was about to find out. Temple of the Dog and Loss as a Catalyst. The Seattle music scene was close-knit, with friendships and rivalries that blurred the boundaries between bands. In 1990, tragedy struck when Andrew Wood, lead singer of Mother Love Bone and one of Chris's closest friends, died from an overdose. The loss hit Cornell like a freight train. Andrew had been more than a friend. He had been a kindred spirit, a creative partner, and a beacon of hope in the sometimes brutal world of rock. Chris responded the only way he knew how, through music. He gathered musicians from Soundgarden and members of a fledgling band that would soon be known as Pearl Jam, creating the supergroup Temple of the Dog. The resulting album, released in 1991, is often described as a tribute, but it is much more than that. Songs like Hunger Strike and Say Hello to Heaven are raw, unfiltered expressions of grief, love, and longing for connection. For Chris, Temple of the Dog was both a farewell to his friend and a cry for help from the depths of his own suffering. The project did not immediately achieve commercial success, but it has since become a cornerstone of grunge history and a testament to the healing power of collaboration. Loss shaped Chris Cornell as an artist, forcing him to confront mortality and the limitations of even the greatest talents. How do you find meaning after losing someone who was your creative mirror? For Chris, the answer was to keep singing, keep writing, and keep searching, even when hope seemed impossibly distant. The rise of Super Unknown. The early 90s were a whirlwind for Soundgarden and for Chris. In 1994, the band released Super Unknown, a record that would become not only their commercial breakthrough, but one of the defining albums of a generation. Black Hole Sun, Fell on Black Days, and The Day I Tried to Live became anthems, not just for grunge fans, but for anyone who had ever struggled with depression, anxiety, or a sense of existential uncertainty. Super Unknown was the album where Chris Cornell's voice reached its full power, moving effortlessly from a whisper to a scream, from hope to despair, and back again. Critics hailed the album as a masterpiece, and it won multiple Grammy Awards. Soundgarden was suddenly everywhere, on the radio, on MTV, headlining massive tours. But success brought new challenges. The demands of touring, the pressures of fame, and the ever-present shadow of addiction all took their toll. Chris, who had never felt truly comfortable in the limelight, found himself growing more isolated even as the band reached new heights. He often spoke about the loneliness of being surrounded by people, but feeling completely alone. Music, which had once been his sanctuary, was now both a refuge and a prison. As Soundgarden soared, so did the weight on Chris's shoulders. Can anyone survive being both a savior and a casualty of their own success? Solo work, experimentation, and Audioslave. Soundgarden disbanded in 1997 at the height of their success, leaving Chris at a crossroads. For many artists, the end of a band means the end of the dream. For Chris, it was a new beginning. He poured himself into a solo career, releasing Euphoria Morning in 1999. The album was introspective, melancholic, and revealed a more vulnerable side of Chris than ever before. Although it did not achieve the same commercial success as Soundgarden's biggest hits, it became a favorite among die-hard fans and critics alike. But Chris was not content to stay in one lane. In 2001, he teamed up with former members of Rage Against the Machine to form Audioslave. The group's debut album in 2002 went triple platinum, powered by the hit single Like a Stone. The partnership was electric. Audioslave brought out a new energy in Chris, blending hard rock with elements of soul, funk, and blues. Through all the experimentation, Chris continued to write and record solo material, never content to be boxed in by genre or expectation. He even recorded the James Bond theme, You Know My Name, for Casino Royale, proving he could adapt his voice and style to almost any musical context. But the creative high could not mask the growing shadows. Chris's struggles with addiction resurfaced, and the pressures of constant reinvention began to weigh heavily on him. What does it mean to be an artist who cannot stop searching? And at what point does reinvention become a form of self-destruction? The battle with addiction. For much of his life, Chris Cornell battled addiction. It started as a way to numb childhood pain, but over the years it became both a curse and a companion. Throughout his career, Chris was open about his struggles with harmful substances and alcohol. He never glamorized his addiction, nor did he use it as an excuse for bad behavior. Instead, he spoke candidly about the realities of substance abuse and the ways it can warp even the most promising futures. During his peak years with Audioslave, Chris relapsed, and his life began to spiral. He checked himself into rehab, determined to break the cycle and reclaim his health and his voice. For nearly a decade afterward, he managed to stay sober, rebuilding relationships with his family and focusing on his music. Yet, even in sobriety, depression never fully released its grip on him. Chris often described depression as a rain that never stopped falling, a feeling of weight and exhaustion that made even simple tasks seem impossible. He continued to take prescription medication for anxiety and insomnia, but these treatments came with their own risks. Despite his best efforts, Chris could never fully escape the shadows. His journey is a reminder that recovery is not a destination, but a process, and that even the strongest among us can be brought low by invisible battles. How do you measure the cost of survival? And how do you know when you have finally won? Quest for stability. While the world saw Chris Cornell as a rock legend, those who knew him best witnessed a very different side. Chris's personal life was not defined by wild parties or endless drama, but by a fierce desire for stability and genuine connection. He married Susan Silver, manager of Soundgarden and Alice in Chains, and together they had a daughter, Lily. This partnership blurred the lines between the professional and the personal. For years, Susan was both his confidant and his business partner, helping him navigate the complexities of stardom. But the pressures of the music industry, combined with Chris's ongoing battles with depression and addiction, eventually strained the marriage to breaking. Their divorce was messy, with lawsuits and public disagreements over custody, finances, and even musical instruments. Still, even in heartbreak, Chris tried to protect his daughter from the chaos that sometimes surrounded his life. Then, in 2004, Chris found love again with Vicky Karayiannis, a publicist with Greek heritage. Their relationship brought a measure of peace Chris had long sought. Together, they had 2 more children, Tony and Christopher Nicholas. Fatherhood became a cornerstone of Chris's later years. He once said he just wanted to be a regular dad, picking up his kids, cooking dinner, reading bedtime stories, and singing to them not as a rock star, but as a parent who had learned the value of ordinary joys. Chris and Vicky also launched a charitable foundation to help vulnerable children and fight human trafficking. For Chris, these efforts were not for publicity. They were a way to give back, to use his voice for something larger than himself. But as the years passed, his quest for stability would remain both a guiding light and a source of profound challenge. Could a man forged in chaos truly find peace in a life built on love? Or would the shadows of the past always threaten to reclaim him? The return of Soundgarden and the last creative surge. The story of most rock bands ends with a breakup. But for Soundgarden, the tale had one final act. In 2010, after years apart, the original members reunited. What began as a tentative collaboration soon turned into a full-blown creative resurgence. They released King Animal in 2012, their first studio album in 16 years. The music was mature, reflective, and full of the wisdom that only comes from enduring heartbreak and loss. The reunion was not just about recapturing past glory. Chris brought to these sessions a new perspective, shaped by fatherhood, sobriety, and years of battling inner demons. The songs were more nuanced, the lyrics deeper, and the interplay between band members more collaborative than ever before. Touring again, Soundgarden found a new audience among younger fans who had discovered grunge through older siblings, film soundtracks, or streaming playlists. For many, seeing Chris Cornell on stage was a revelation, a frontman whose intensity had only deepened with age. He performed with a rawness and authenticity that set him apart from so many other artists, proof that great art can evolve even after decades in the spotlight. But the resurgence came with its own price. The pressures of the road, the expectations of fans and critics, and the old temptations that haunted Chris since his teens all threatened to undo the fragile peace he had built. Was it possible to reclaim what was lost? Or was the cost of a second act more than anyone could bear? The evolution of an artist. Chris Cornell refused to let himself be defined by any one genre, and throughout his career, he continuously experimented with new musical directions. After Soundgarden, his solo projects revealed a musician restless for growth. Euphoria Morning, released in 1999, was a deeply personal record full of subtle melodies and introspective lyrics. It showed a side of Chris far removed from the heavy riffs and howling vocals of his band days. In 2009, he surprised both fans and critics with Scream, a collaboration with producer Timbaland that veered into electronic and pop influences. The album was divisive, with some longtime followers questioning the direction, but for Chris, it was never about pleasing others. He understood that true artistry meant taking risks, even at the cost of popularity. The later years saw Chris returning to acoustic roots, embracing stripped-down arrangements that put the spotlight squarely on his voice and his words. In Higher Truth, his last solo album, he sounded older, wiser, and more at peace, yet still vulnerable. Cover songs, such as his haunting rendition of Prince's Nothing Compares to You and his poignant performance of The Promise, showcased his versatility and his deep empathy for those suffering injustice and loss. By refusing to settle or play it safe, Chris Cornell became not just a survivor of grunge, but a symbol of artistic evolution itself. Can an artist ever truly outrun their beginnings? Or do those early influences always shape their journey, no matter how far they travel? The pressure of legacy and the search for meaning. As Chris entered his 50s, he carried with him a legacy few artists could match. Millions of records sold, multiple Grammy nominations, a place in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But accolades and awards could not answer the most pressing questions. What was it all for? And had the pain been worth it? For someone as introspective as Chris, fame was never enough. He was driven by a need to create, to communicate, to help others feel less alone in their suffering. But this same drive could also become a burden, as the world expected him to remain a hero, a savior, a voice for those who could not speak for themselves. In interviews, Chris was honest about the toll his career had taken on his mind and spirit. He struggled to reconcile his public persona with the private person who sometimes felt overwhelmed by darkness. The more the world celebrated his achievements, the more isolated he could become. He sought out therapy, leaned on his family, and channeled his energies into causes he believed in. But the search for lasting meaning was always ongoing. How do you measure a life lived so intensely when the very thing that made you special is also the thing that makes happiness so elusive? For Chris Cornell, this question would echo until the very end. The final tour and the night that changed everything. In the spring of 2017, Soundgarden set out on a North American tour. The shows were well attended, the band seemed tight, and Chris, to most fans, appeared healthy and focused. Yet those closest to him noticed subtle changes, a tiredness in his eyes, a distant quality to his voice, occasional slips during performances. On May 17, 2017, after playing a concert at Detroit's Fox Theater, Chris returned to his hotel room at the MGM Grand. He spoke to his wife, Vicky, on the phone. She later recalled that he sounded groggy and disoriented, possibly under the influence of medication. Concerned, she asked hotel staff to check on him. Shortly after midnight, Chris Cornell was found dead. The cause ruled as self-harm by hanging. The news sent shockwaves through the music world. Tributes poured in from fans, fellow musicians, and artists across genres. But as grief turned to questions, the circumstances of Chris's death became the subject of intense scrutiny. Toxicology reports showed several prescription substances in his system, none in lethal doses, but enough to raise concerns about their combined effects on his mood and decision-making. The sense of loss was magnified by the fact that, only weeks later, Chester Bennington, Chris's close friend and lead singer of Linkin Park, died by self-harm on what would have been Chris's 53rd birthday. Was there more to these tragedies than met the eye? Or were they simply the cruel culmination of battles long fought in silence? Theories and controversy. The suddenness and mystery of Chris Cornell's passing gave rise to speculation and theories that persist to this day. Some fans believe that prescription substances, especially Ativan, may have caused or contributed to an altered mental state, leading to an impulsive act he would not have chosen otherwise. Others, including his widow, have argued that Chris did not intend to end his life, pointing to his recent activism, his love for his children, and his plans for the future. A more controversial theory emerged in online forums and social media, suggesting Chris was involved in efforts to expose child abuse and trafficking, and that his death may have been more than a personal tragedy. While there is no verified evidence supporting these claims, the timing and circumstances of his death, closely followed by Bennington's, have fueled persistent rumors and ongoing investigations by independent researchers and journalists. Whatever the truth, one fact remains. Chris Cornell's struggle with mental health was real and profound, and the stigma surrounding depression and addiction is still a barrier for countless people. In the wake of his death, advocates and artists have renewed calls for greater support, awareness, and compassion for those who battle invisible wounds. Does a legacy grow larger with unanswered questions? Or do those questions simply keep the wound open for a world still trying to understand why such a bright light had to go out? The wave of grief. In the weeks and months after Chris Cornell's passing, the world witnessed an outpouring of emotion that extended far beyond the expected circles of devoted fans or fellow musicians. Social media feeds, late-night television tributes, and local radio stations filled with the sound of his voice, with fans sharing memories of the first time his music changed their lives. Candlelight vigils appeared in cities across the globe, stretching from Seattle's rainy streets to sunlit parks in Athens, Sydney, Buenos Aires, and Tokyo. For Chris's family, the loss was devastating and disorienting. Vicky Karayiannis, his widow, became an advocate almost overnight, urging people to reconsider the way they talk about self-harm, depression, and the hidden dangers of certain prescription substances. She and their children faced relentless media attention while wrestling with grief that often felt too raw for words. The family leaned on each other, their closest friends, and a tight-knit network within the music industry to navigate the months that followed. Many in the Seattle music scene, both old legends and new voices, rallied to remember Chris not just as a rock icon, but as a generous friend. Old bandmates, producers, and crew shared stories of his quiet acts of kindness, a surprise birthday call, a last-minute benefit performance, or simply time spent listening to someone's struggles backstage. The shared grief helped spark new conversations about the burdens of fame, the cost of silence, and the importance of supporting artists away from the spotlight. Why does the passing of a single artist echo so far and wide? Perhaps it is because Chris Cornell's voice became a vessel for so many private sorrows, and in mourning him, people could finally let out a part of their own. The ripple effect. After the initial shock faded, Chris Cornell's death took on a larger meaning for advocates, mental health professionals, and the music industry as a whole. Artists who had previously hidden their own struggles began to speak out, inspired by the honesty Chris himself had shown throughout his career. Festivals and radio stations organized benefit concerts for self-harm prevention, and grunge legends returned to the stage to play his music, not as an act of nostalgia, but as a lifeline for those still fighting unseen battles. The Chris and Vicky Cornell Foundation expanded its reach, providing funding for mental health resources in schools and communities where young people felt especially isolated. New programs emerged in Seattle, New York, Los Angeles, and beyond, encouraging open dialogue about depression and addiction. Hotlines, therapy sessions, and peer support groups started using Chris's story to show that even those who seem successful and loved are not immune to pain. Documentaries and books began chronicling not just the history of grunge, but the mental health crisis that claimed so many of its brightest voices. Writers and journalists tracked the common threads: creative intensity, childhood trauma, relentless pressure, and an industry that often rewarded self-destruction. The hope was that telling the truth about these stories, without sensationalizing or minimizing them, could prevent another tragedy. How many lives have been saved because someone heard Chris Cornell's music at just the right moment? How many more might be helped if we continue to talk openly, honestly, and without shame? Tributes, concerts, and the global celebration of a voice. Tributes to Chris Cornell did not end after the first wave of mourning. They grew, multiplied, and transformed into ongoing celebrations of his life and art. In January 2019, a concert called I Am the Highway brought together a lineup of musicians that would have been unthinkable a decade before. Metallica, Foo Fighters, Miley Cyrus, Adam Levine, and members of Soundgarden, Audioslave, and Temple of the Dog. The stage was a place of catharsis, where peers and protégés sang his songs with trembling voices and tears. Elsewhere, major orchestras and choirs adapted Chris's music for classical performance. Universities and music schools began teaching his songwriting as part of their curricula. Even beyond the music industry, artists, poets, and filmmakers drew inspiration from the way Chris put pain into words and melody, finding in his vulnerability a blueprint for their own work. Street murals appeared from Seattle to Berlin to Sao Paulo, depicting Chris's intense gaze or the flowing lines of his lyrics. Fans raised funds for scholarships in his name, purchased his records to support his foundation, and gathered on anniversaries to play his music in parks, record shops, and small local clubs. What does it mean to honor someone's legacy? Not with empty praise, but with creativity, compassion, and the courage to keep their spirit alive. Beyond the spotlight. It is tempting to define Chris Cornell by his public persona, but his deepest legacy may be the quiet ways he shaped the people closest to him. For his children, he was not a distant superstar, but a father who played games, told stories, and took an active role in their lives despite the demands of fame. He made time for recitals, helped with homework, and brought music into their home as something to be shared, not idolized. To friends, he was the confidant who returned phone calls, sent thoughtful gifts, and encouraged them through their own creative blocks. He championed young musicians, supported behind-the-scenes workers, and rarely said no to a request for help, even when he was struggling himself. Those who worked with Chris in the studio remember his exacting standards, but also his humility, his willingness to try something new, to admit when he was wrong, to laugh at his mistakes, and to lift others up when they faltered. In an industry famous for egos, Chris's generosity left a mark that cannot be measured in ticket sales or album charts. The lessons he left are subtle but profound. Kindness is not weakness. Sensitivity can be a source of strength. And healing, though often incomplete, is always worth pursuing. What if every artist gave as much to those around them as Chris Cornell did? How different might the world of music be? If Chris Cornell's life taught us anything, it is that every voice matters, even the quiet ones, even the ones in pain. If this story moved you, consider supporting mental health resources or sharing his music with someone who needs it. Like, subscribe, and share your own memories below. The conversation about healing, art, and hope does not end here. It continues every time a song lifts you up or a story reminds you to hold on. Chris's voice still echoes wherever there is struggle and hope. Will you help keep his memory alive? Share what his music means to you, or reach out to someone going through darkness. Sometimes a single act of kindness or a single song played at the right moment can make all the difference. Stay strong, stay curious, and see you in the next video.